Michelle, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to come share your insight and perspective with the Policy Circle community. And I think maybe we should start with, tell us a little bit about your background and how that informs your perspective right now, and in particular, the experience you've had in Europe and how that's shaping your reaction to what is undeniably a war in Europe that has started as of today.
Well, first, Stacey, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for offering this platform and chance to communicate with your with your nationwide chapters, because it is such an incredibly important topic. And frankly, while we could say, "Oh, it's happening in Europe," this will have repercussions on the entire world, and of course here at home in the United States. As you mentioned, Ukraine is really dear to my heart. So my background is primarily rooted in international development. So I have worked both in the U.S. government, as in policy and national security positions, as well as for a decade of my career working in a nonprofit organization called the International Republican Institute, which really focused on building democratic societies worldwide. And early on, through both my time at the White House and the National Security Council, at that time led by Dr. Condoleezza Rice, I was in the Eurasia division, where at that time it was so fascinating because that was in the early 2000s. And I learned so much about the ideas of, freedom and democratic transition. And Dr. Rice, of course, herself was a long scholar and expert on the former Soviet Union, and really the dissolution of that, as well as the newly independent states and their road really to political and economic security. And so I was there actually when the Orange Revolution happened in 2004. And I will say that really changed the course of my career. It was something to watch history unfold. We had seen the Rose Revolution in Georgia prior to this, and we were seeing these brave Democrats in Eurasia saying, listen, give us a chance. We want freedom. We don't want to go back to the old world order, right? And so what was happening was, in those 10 plus years since the USSR had dissolved, these newly sovereign independent states, right, they were still grappling with that political and economic transition. And over time, increasingly authoritarian presidents started creeping back in, right, and trying to bring the countries back instead of forward. And the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, the Ukrainians stood up and said, no, we've been here before, we're not going back. After that time, I went to IRI and I was able to work in the Eurasia division. And I worked on the countries such as Belarus, which you're hearing a lot about right now, still very closely aligned with Russia and Ukraine. And so I have just a deep and abiding respect for the people of that region, and just a hope that they will be able to, without interference from Russia, be able to live out that destiny as a sovereign country.
And over the last 24 hours, have you had an opportunity to communicate with your friends and colleagues in the Ukraine? And if so, what are you hearing from them?
I have, and it's been like all of us, right? It's text messages, it's Facebook messages, it's email. And I will say this: I'm reminded again of the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people, right? All of the responses I've gotten back were, thank you, for thinking of us, thank you for standing with Ukraine. Thank you for offering to pray for us. The Ukrainian people are so strong, they're so devoted, and they're so generous of spirit. This is a very scary time. I mean, we're all watching the news cycles, right? We, I think, had hoped this wouldn't happen. The Ukrainian people themselves hoped this wouldn't happen. But when Russia first annexed Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainian people have always in the back of their head feared that was only the beginning of a larger scale invasion, and they were correct.
In the world that we're living in now, and especially the Russia that we are dealing with now, is very different than the one we were dealing with in 2014. Can you give us a sense of the moves perhaps that Putin has been making for quite some time so that ultimately that you would have this invasion?
I think you have to go back and look at why this happened in 2014 in the first place. The annexation of Crimea happened days to weeks after the Kremlin, let me say, the Kremlin friendly president of Ukraine was deposed in the Maidan Revolution. Again, the people of Ukraine said, no, no more. We want democracy. We want transparency. We want to turn towards the West. They also made it very clear they wanted to establish stronger relationships with NATO and the EU. That shook Putin to his core. He couldn't have that. He couldn't have that on his doorstep. That's what happened in 2014. I think Putin himself, I think everyone in the Kremlin always knew this day would come. I think they have taken their time. And I think we knew, especially in the last month, right, when he went on his state television to say, to recognize the two regions that had declared their self-autonomous status in the East. We knew this was something that was in his mind. I think what's important to understand is this. This is not something the Ukrainians wanted. This is something Putin has wanted. And I found it so fascinating when you listen to experts talk about Russia, they say the same thing. Putin only fears his people. He fears his control of his people. He fears democracy like nothing else. For Putin, a strong democratic Ukraine was frankly a threat he couldn't really tolerate, especially when you look at political events that have unfolded the last couple of years in Russia. To try to continue to consolidate his power, what has he done? He has been accused of poisoning Navalny, his really chief opponent in the opposition, who is now, of course, imprisoned. This is not the first time we've seen this. Anytime he sees a crack and he worries about his hold, he strikes out. He is an aggressor.
And what do you think about sort of the world we're living in right now, the world order, the power or maybe the lack of power of the West has emboldened Putin to move now?
Well, I'd actually answer that question by saying this. I don't think we can give Putin that credit. Because if we give him that inch and say, oh, he did this because there's been a breakdown in a global, let's say, leadership or world order. I've heard others say, is it because the United States is, retreating? That's actually not quite fair, first of all, to the United States, and it gives him credit he does not deserve. Putin would have done this regardless. This has always been part of his plan. You look at his rhetoric over, the 4 terms he has served as president in Ukraine, and you could see this happening. This is not the first time he has invaded a neighboring country. I would also say this. I do think, though, that this is a clarion call to all of us in the world to remind ourselves this is why global leadership matters. This is why isolationism is not an option. Internationalism can take different forms, but what we have to remember is when we stand back, when we don't stand up for liberty and ideals such as democracy, sovereignty, it does allow sort of the space for these ideas and these aggressors to flourish.
Maybe let's talk about some broader
Mhm,
concepts for just a
mhm.
minute because you do such a good job explaining this. I read an article today in Barry Weiss's Substack that's quite good. And one of the quotes is from former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster.
Mhm.
It said, "Deterrence is a simple equation of capability times will." And I think many of our adversaries today think our will, he's referencing our will to wage war, is zero, and that we're setting ourselves up for a cascading crisis. How will the US and the West control this situation that feels out of control if we are not willing to exercise any military force?
Stacey, that is the $1 million question. I'm glad you've answered it because we have to think about it this way. By the time a conflict escalates to the point where military, let's say, incursion or response is our only option, we have already lost most of our opportunity. So I currently work at the US Global Leadership Coalition. And one of the things that has really struck me about our advocacy is our advisory council of former 3 and 4-star generals who say this: if we invest in diplomacy and development, we save $16 on the back end if we were to have to address a crisis through war or military means as the only solution. So I want people, first of all, to think about it this way. There's a lot of conversation right now about, is it the fact that the US has shown that we don't want to be in endless conflict, that we don't want to embark in military incursion? And I would say two things. First, what we've learned over the decades is this: diplomacy and trying to resolve the conflict before it gets to those means is the best way to solve the issue. I also want to point out this: NATO. NATO was created in 1949 as this major alliance because it was prescient. It said we need to have a body that comes together and says, never again, not on our conflict. An attack on one is an attack on all of us.
Michelle, there have been a series of sanctions since 2014. And of course, over the last several days, the US and our allies in the West have been listing out a series of economic sanctions. Do you believe that this latest, more aggressive round of sanctioning, is that going to enter into Putin's risk-benefit calculus to the point he might perhaps shorten this conflict or change his plans?
So it's a good question. And here's what we have to remember about sanctions: they're not immediately felt, right? And it is a tool we often use, and not only ourselves, but the rest of the international community, to try to stave off conflict or to your point, shorten it. I will say this: the financial sanctions, specifically the ones that President Biden announced today, are significant. I think there's more that can be done, and I think the US government's looking at that. What we have to remember is it will not be felt immediately overnight. And unfortunately, with all sanctions, and why we're very careful as governments to impose them, really those who will be most affected, right, are the Russian people themselves. I also want to remind people, why is this important when it comes to responding to Putin? Russia's GDP and economy are not as strong as people often think. In fact, I believe Russia's economy right now is about 10% of that of the US and the rest of Europe, right? And when you look at the entire NATO alliance, the GDP only equals about 1/20th of that, right? So this is really hitting Russia in a spot where they can't really take it. And again, remember what I said earlier: Putin fears his own people. He fears the hold he has on his people. He's really already quashed any sort of democratic dissent, freedom of assembly, of speech. As I said earlier, he's already imprisoned his chief opposition leader. So a crashing and strained economy is not going to be good for Putin. I would also really use this stat to kind of point this out. Today, it was reported that actually, after Putin invaded Ukraine, the Russian stock market took its biggest hit in history, and it lost nearly 40% of its value. What does that mean? It's already just the threat of sanctions, just the threat of international response is already hurting their economy.
And I'd have to think too that there's questions, I guess, in the international community. Is this the end to Russia trying to be part of a international community? And because these sanctions will virtually sever opportunities, not only economically, but there's discussions of diplomatically, ejecting diplomats, cutting them off from SWIFT, which is the whole international banking platform. So you've got to wonder if Putin's so determined to reassemble the Soviet Union that he's willing to be cut off from the rest of the world. Do you think that they're willing that really the people are going to be willing to put up with that?
So I think it's two things. I think with everything Putin does is he's going to gauge his next steps by what the collective West, as he likes to call all of us, is going to do. And I think that's why it's so important that, one, we remain steadfast in our messaging, in our actions, not only as the United States, but with NATO, with the European Union. Because if we do that, right, if we cut off economic opportunities, if we cut off diplomatic ties, where does Russia have to go? We all know he has been communicating, I know just most recently before the Olympics with China. But is China really his hope? China might be his only option. But even if we look at a Russia versus Chinese partnership, right, you have two strong autocratic, if you will, leaders who really aren't used to being second place. So who is that relationship really going to benefit? So I would say that as long as we stay steadfast, this becomes a game where I don't think Putin can really hold out. And again, the Russian people are the ones who are going to suffer. And I think it's going to get to the point where the Russian people say enough.
Well, and I noticed in protests today that they were arresting any of the protesters in Russia. I was, I don't know, I guess something in my heart felt a little hope knowing that they were willing, knowing they were going to be arrested to step out. Let's talk about the humanitarian crisis this perhaps creates. Uh, Having worked at USAID, Michelle, and the other organizations where you've been so involved in evaluating various crises over the decades, what is the impact that we should expect to see first on the Ukrainian people?
Stacey, you have already sort of predicted this will be a humanitarian crisis. We have already heard today, we've gotten the reports of the thousands of people, fleeing the country, right? And if you look at the geography of where Ukraine is situated, they are largely going to go towards their partners to the west, but primarily Poland and Romania, right? The two very much open, democratic, current members of the EU. So, what we're going to see now is a humanitarian issue on top of everything else going on, where you're going to see neighboring countries, like we do in any crisis, quickly trying to mobilize support for the masses that are fleeing, and then looking at what is the solution, right? What does that look like? At USAID, unfortunately, this was where a majority of our efforts ended up being focused. If you look across the world today, we are currently experiencing more and more protracted crises than the world has ever seen. And that means, again, that forward investment in diplomacy, in development is so crucial, because else we are going to be faced with really a no-win situation, and the needs are going to be so great.
And what exactly do you expect the US government to do to start meeting those needs? Which agencies, what types of support will we offer, I guess, most immediately?
Yep. It's a great question. So we'll immediately begin, bilateral conversations with, our bilateral partners in the region. This is where USAID, again, is the world's premier donor of humanitarian assistance. I expect, and I know they will, they're already working in Ukraine, right? They've already been working for the last 3 decades on programs. They have a very strong mission in Ukraine. They will be very active in this. We'll also increasingly look to our European Union counterparts, right? Funding through them. We'll look at UNHCR through the UN. This is where, especially when we look at the humanitarian needs, this is when we need to bring in the when we need to bring in our bilateral partners, as well as these larger associations of countries to come in, and everyone will do their part.
I know that a number of Americans are extremely upset. They want to stand with the citizens of Ukraine. What advice would you give to an ordinary citizen like myself in Dallas, Texas, far away from this conflict? What can I be doing as a citizen? And what are some steps that we could recommend people take, maybe to be of assistance in a time of crisis like this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say this. Unfortunately, this is a learning moment for all of us. The first thing I would have people do is understand this is why American leadership across the world matters. We need to stand with our partners. We need to work on issues and make sure that we can prevent crises like these ever happening. Putin had made up his mind. He's invaded Ukraine. There will be, as we mentioned, huge amount of refugees. There will be so many needs. What we can do here in the United States is several things. First, always be in contact with your elected representatives. Congress will have a large role to play in this. There will, I'm sure, and I know they're already working on this, looking at what kind of assistance does Ukraine need, and they need it now. Let your elected officials know you support that. You support our efforts to provide this aid and assistance to Ukraine. The other thing is, and I will say this, we've seen this recently with the unprecedented number of Afghan refugees that have come to our country. We may be called upon always in our communities to look out for those in need. So I would say, even if it's not Ukraine, work with your local social committees, faith-based organizations, local communities. Ask how you can help. Some of it may be advocacy, but there may be a lot of other opportunities to provide goods or funding.
I'd love all of those pieces of advice. And I think that we'll make sure that we post some resources in here too, so that people can do this. But you touched on something that's going to force me to maybe go backwards just a little bit. This is a learning opportunity. And I would love for you to elaborate on that just a little bit more, Michelle, because even in the midst of this crisis, you still have many Americans that want to know, why does this matter? Why does this matter to me? And you still have camps really on both sides of the aisle who will say, we shouldn't invest in endless wars. We shouldn't get involved. We need to focus on our own problems. Can you maybe help illuminate why that type of thinking perhaps got us here to begin with?
Stacey, it is so important. And I urge everyone to think of this. First of all, we have to reframe how we think of things. Endless wars is never a phrase I would have used. I worked for years through USAID and IRI programs to support our development initiatives in Afghanistan. I met just this week with a dear friend of mine who was the youngest woman ever elected to Afghan's parliament. And she has said something that so resonated with me. It is hard outside of the country to understand what value U.S. support to Afghanistan meant, right? These are decades of especially women who now have had opportunities for education. The Afghan people now know what freedom is and can be again, right? And to say that it didn't matter and that it didn't make a difference is really to ignore and really disrespect those brave generations of Afghans who have said, we finally have a voice, we want to use it to do good. I will say this. When we stand back, when we don't exert our voices, when we don't call out what is aggression, what is wrong, we will continue to see aggressors around the world looking for those opportunities to capitalize on what they think might be a lack of interest or support around the world. I was hit today when I read the statistic that today's aggression in Ukraine was the largest military incursion since World War II. I am a profound reader and studier of all things World War II, and that shook me to my core. There's a famous quote by Senator Vandenberg from Michigan, who went into World War II, like so many Americans on both sides of the aisle at that time, who proclaimed themselves isolationists. When America was attacked during Pearl Harbor, he said, not only to the constituents, but to the president, to the nation, there is no room for isolationism when it comes to realism. We can't afford, for the sake of our own country, our own people, and our own borders, to step back and think we don't have a role to play.
Wow, it's so powerful. And I think it's such an important conversation to be having right now. Otherwise, we don't learn from the moment. So that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. When we talk about why people should care here in the United States about this conflict, you mentioned that we are going to feel the ramifications from this. Can you give us a little more insight on what that's going to look like?
Unfortunately, the entire world right now is still dealing with the effects of COVID. What has COVID taught us? The world is interconnected like ever before. What happens globally will 100% affect us here at home in some way or in the other. Right now, with the invasion of Ukraine, we will see undoubtedly our costs here for things from everything from gas to food go up. Why? Because when you have issues like this, when you know that Russia right now accounts for over 40% of all of the natural gas and energy supplies into Europe, this is about to become either cut off, where they'll cut it off to their Western allies, of course. We also know, so what will that do? That's going to affect globally, right? Energy and gas prices. What else do we know? Ukraine and Russia are the world's, they've often been called, Ukraine especially, the world's breadbasket. You look at the fact that right now, Ukraine exports about 40% of all its wheat to the developing world. You also look at the fact that through the Black Sea, Ukraine and Russia both export their wheat and other agricultural commodities. That is going to be upended. That will likely be halted, especially as we see this invasion moving into full-scale military incursion and war continue. That will absolutely, in a matter of time, reverberate not only first across Ukraine, but it will come to the United States. And so we will see, unfortunately, what we will most see is our pocketbooks being affected. What we pray is that it will not further affect our security. What we have always said is in development and diplomacy, the major reasons we support this as soft power initiatives is because we understand the effects this has on both our national security as well as our prosperity.
And I know that there are concerns about potential cyber attacks as well. What can you tell us about that?
It's real. It's happening. And it's again one of these things where we've known it's been happening for years. The Europeans themselves have felt this acutely. You look at examples from Estonia, from Ukraine, from that area, and we've seen it here in the United States. So again, there are so many. If you look at 2022 and where we're at, there are so many threats we face. Right? It's what we consider, military, right? Sort of the old school sort of war effects. It's technological, right? This is very concerning, especially knowing Russia is still a superpower when it comes to its arsenal of nuclear weapons. And today we heard the reports. What did they do? They immediately took over Chernobyl, right, in Ukraine. So we need to be concerned about this because warfare looks very different now than it did in World War II. And we all know the effects World War II had.
When you bring up Chernobyl, I actually had a text from my college freshman last night asking me about this. And lo and behold, she read our policy circle brief. So I was proud of her and she was making an effort. But about an hour later, she said, could there be nuclear war? And having that question come from your young person who's just embarking on her life was pretty shocking because I don't think that, think you and I, we haven't thought about this since the 80s, since the Cold War. And so when you have kids asking you, could there be nuclear war? I'm going to put you on the spot. How do we answer that?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, the answer is always we don't know, but of course, anything's a possibility. Putin is ruthless. Putin has proven himself not to play by international order. He does not appear to hold the same standards we hold when it comes to integrity, doing what's right. And Stacey, to your point, I think, I remember being that child in the 70s and 80s who did the drills at school under my desk in case there was a nuclear attack on the United States. And it just reminds me history repeats itself. And while I'm so sorry your child is asking that question, I think it again shows us this is why we can never be asleep at the wheel. This is why we can never turn our attention from what's happening overseas, because unfortunately, we can't anticipate when moments like this will arise. And these are really valid concerns.
Mm, great response. Love that.